thanks to all my supporters. Links are down below in the description if you want to help out the channel. Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about render passes and how to render out multiple passes so you have more flexibility when compositing. Now before we get started, I just want to thank everybody who suggested this tutorial. If you want to suggest future tutorials, make sure to comment down below. Now if you want to work along with us, links are down in the description below for you guys to download the files, but let's go ahead and get started. First thing we need to do is actually motion track our footage. So let's come to the motion tracking, open up our footage. Okay, so here is our footage. I'm just going to open up that clip and then come over here, go to color management, and instead of the filmic view transform, we need standard, just so the colors are more accurate. Then let's go ahead and set the scene frames and prefetch our footage. Now for the sake of this tutorial, I'm only going to be working with the first 100 frames just to speed things up, but if you want, you can work with all of the frames. But now let's go ahead and camera track our footage. If I hold Control and click, we can put down a tracker, and if I hit Alt S, we can reveal the search area. Now this is actually way too small. We actually need to increase both of these, so I'm going to increase this a bit, and let's increase the search size as well. And then these has changed. This looks pretty good for what I'm going to be using this for. So let's just hit A and then delete both of those. Next, we need to set the match to be previous frame. We're going to hit normalize. And then the tracking settings extra, we're going to hit the correlation to be a 0.9. Now we just need to place markers on all of these little dots right here. So I'm just going to, again, hold Control and place the tracking markers on each one of these little dots. Okay, once we have that, we can hit A and then hold Control and T, and those will start tracking forward. Okay, so we've reached the end of our clip. That is looking good. Now we can go ahead and solve our little animation. So I'm going to set keyframe, then focal length, optical center, and radial distortion, and then solve the camera motion. Okay, we can see that we got a huge solve error of a 93, and that actually might be because our A and B keyframe didn't change. So let's try to find the area where there is the most parallax in our footage. So I'm going to say around 60. And then we'll just go to the end of the clip, 100, and now let's try solving that camera motion. And you can see by changing those two things, we got our solve error down to a 0.19. That is really good. If you don't get something like this, just keep placing trackers, and you can even come down here and clean up some tracks like that, but we're going to stick with this. Okay, so now we're ready to set up our tracking scene. So let's scroll down, set up tracking scene right there. You should notice that this pops up over here. However, our points aren't actually aligned to the floor. So let's go ahead and change that real quick. So I'm going to come select 3 points down here, preferably on the floor and in a 90-degree triangle. So these 3 points make a 90-degree triangle on our floor. So let's just come to the orientation tab, hit floor, and now you can see our dots are on the floor. Now we just need to orientate our scene. So I'm going to set this little dot to be our origin. And then this one can be our x-axis. So now it's rotated correctly. And then since it's rotated now, we can now set our origin to be our little center dot right here. And I'm also going to select 2 random points and just set the scale. And I can come down here and move that scale to something that I like. So right around there is what I'm going to stick with. Now we are done with motion tracking. I'm going to come back to layout. I'm going to hit G, Z, and then I'm going to hold Control and snap that up 1 unit just so our little cube is on the floor plane now. And now if I come here, hit H to hide this little plane, if we play this little animation, we will see that our cube is correctly camera tracked to the floor. Okay, so now that we have that, let's hit Alt H to unhide everything. So Blender automatically sets up some settings when we do camera tracking that I don't really like, so let's go ahead and change some of those. So first of all, this background collection, I just want to delete that and put the ground in our foreground. And then we can go ahead and delete this background view layer, since we don't really need to work in that. And also in compositing, we can go ahead and delete these 4 nodes, plug this node into the image, and then convert to pre-multiply. And now we have the basic scene set up inside Blender. So now back in the layout tab, we actually need to place in some of our objects in our scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this cube right here. And then if you downloaded the things in the description, you can come to File. We're going to import this FBX. And then find the FBX file right here, and then we can just import that in. You can see it's basically a little cottage, and so right now that's way too big, so we can just scale that down until we get something that we like. And then we need to move this to be on our floor plane, so G, Z, like that, and you can kind of see it's clipping into the floor like that. You can also come to the side view up here, and then go into wireframe by holding Z, and you can get it right on this floor plane. And then we need to come up to the camera. We can go back into solid view, and then if we hit G, then Shift Z, that'll move on every axis but the x-axis. So we can just move it somewhere right here, scale it up a little bit, and then let's just rotate on the Z until we get something that we like. Okay, so here's what I'm going to stick with. If we go ahead and go into render view, you'll see that we have a lot of stuff wrong. And this is actually a good time to set some of our render properties. So first of all, we want to render in cycles. We want to render on our GPU. And then we want to, we can leave the render sample count right here. adaptive sampling on, denoising in the viewport on. Then light paths, we can set all these top ones to be 3. Leave the bottom one on 0. Since we're not dealing with any reflective things in this scene, we can turn both of these off. Next, if we simplify our scene and then come into the film tab, we want to change it to transparent. And then finally, we can set our performance to be 512 by 512 since we are rendering on a GPU. Okay, so now let's go into rendered view just to see what we're working with. We can now see that our shadow catcher plane is working how it's intended, and also it looks a lot better. However, we don't have any textures on this little object right now, so make sure to go download the textures in the description below, and we can just put those on real quick. Go into the shading tab, and then we can just add in a image texture node. We can go ahead and duplicate that since we will be inputting 2 textures. So let's open up the first one. The first one is going to be our diffuse, so open that up. That is basically the color of our scene, so I'm just going to put that into our base color of our principal BSDF. And then the next one, we need to open up the other texture, which is our normal PNG, so open that up. And we can plug this into the normal map that's right here. And then the color space, we need it, instead of sRGB, we need it to be non-color. So like that, and now that is actually the shading finished for our little cabin. Okay, so let's come back out to the layout tab just to see what we're working with. Let's actually move this light. The window where my in real life scene is right over here, so we need to move the light somewhere over there. So now we have this little scene. We will see we are having some clipping issues, so let's just increase this all the way up just as much as we can. We can play around with this a little bit later if we need to. But yeah, that is looking good. We can now see that we have shadow in our scene, and we have our building being correctly motion tracked. Okay, so now we can start getting into the render passes. Now looking at this, I can already tell that we need a lot of work done. We can see that the shadow looks alright, but it looks kind of weird. And we're not getting really any reflection off of that house, the light bouncing off the house and then hitting this little bed, so we can play around with some of that. So if we come into the compositing section, this is where we're going to be seeing all of our render passes, so let's just move that over there. Now for our render layers node, we only have the image, the alpha, and then the depth. If you want to select those, I'm just holding shift, control, and clicking. So that will cycle through the different ones. So right now we only have our image. However, we can enable some other render passes. So if I come over to the view layer properties, we can see all the passes right here. Now there is a lot of passes for all these. You can see and change around the different glossy, diffusion, all that. The only ones that we really care about today is the ambient occlusion. Now you might be wondering why we aren't selecting the shadow, and if I actually go ahead and select the shadow and go ahead and render out an image, if we come back and actually view that shadow, we will see that it gives us this result. Now I'm not really too sure what you would use this pass for, other than maybe correcting some of the non-shadowed parts, so all this white stuff. So that's not really what we want. We just want a pass that is simply just a shadow and nothing else. And then the AO pass, here is the AO pass, basically just those shadows that it creates on itself. So that's going to be very important later. So now that we know why we're not using the shadow, so let's just turn that off. Now a way we can actually get these shadows separate from our little object is actually playing around with some view layers and some collections. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's come back out to layout. So basically what we need is 2 different collections for both our house and our shadow. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to right click, hit new collection. This first collection I'm just going to name house, and then make another collection, and I'm going to name this shadow. And I accidentally put one in the other, so let's just drag that out. And so my ground plane is what's going to be casting the shadow. So I want this ground plane in the shadow collection. And then my house is actually this cube. So let's just put that in the house collection. And also, since we imported the FBX file, we can go ahead and delete this camera and also this little lamp right here. So just delete those 2 things. Okay, so now that we have the different things in our collections, we can actually go ahead and make another view layer. So let's come up here. I'm going to hit this little button, hit new. And this view layer is going to be called our shadow. And then we can switch between the different view layers from shadow to foreground. I'm actually going to name this foreground house just so we can organize some things. Okay, so now what we basically want to do is in our house view layer, we basically just want the house and no shadows or anything. And then in the shadow layer, we only want the shadow and not the house. So that way, when we composite, we can composite the 2 together. Okay, so first, let's just do the house. So go to the house view layer. Okay, so for the house view layer, we only want the house. However, we still want the shadow layer to affect the house, just because it's going to look weird if it doesn't. So right now, if I actually disable the shadow layer, you can see right on the edge of the house, most specifically like right here, you can see we're getting some bounce sliding off of the ground plane up onto the house. So if we take away the ground plane, it basically just removes all that lighting. So what we need to do is, instead of disabling it, we can select it, right click, and then come down to view layer, and we can set this to be indirect only. Now you can see that all of the light is still bouncing off of it. However, we aren't getting any of the shadow over here. Okay, so this is what we want for the house view layer. We can go ahead and come to the shadow view layer as well. And we just need to do the opposite. We basically only want the shadow and not the house. So let's select the house collection, go to view layer and set indirect only, and now we only have the shadow. Okay, so now if I come over to the house view layer, if we come down to the view layer properties, we can see that we have ambient occlusion selected. We actually don't need ambient occlusion for the house for this specific one, but if you wanted to mess around with the ambient occlusion for the house, you can go ahead and render that out as well. But for this tutorial, we're just gonna unselect that. And then for the shadow view layer, if we come over here, we do want the ambient occlusion because we want the ambient occlusion around the house down here. We don't really care about the ambient occlusion on the house. Okay, so now with all that set up, we need to go ahead and render out all the different passes. Now if I come up to the compositing tab, you can see all these different passes. We actually don't need the movie clip since we're going to be compositing that in after. So let's just delete both of these and plug these into the composite and then the viewer. And so to render out just a house, we need to make sure that we have our house view layer selected down here, like that. And then if we go ahead and render out an image, so you can see what this is. It's basically just the house with a transparent background, which is what we want. So exit out of that, and then we're going to come set up some render properties. Now these render properties are going to be the same for all the things that we render out, so I'm not going to explain it every single time, but all you want to do is come down here to the output setting. Okay, so I would recommend making its own folder since we are going to be rendering this out as a PNG sequence. So go ahead and make a new folder. You can call this whatever you want. I just named my previous one house pass, like that. So we're just going to make this little house folder, and then we can double click inside there and hit accept. And then down here, we want to make sure it's on PNG RGBA for the alpha channel. And then compression, I like to turn that to 0%. And again, we are just doing 1 to 100, but feel free to do the whole animation. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and render that animation. Okay, so now for the other passes, we're going to come down here. First, let's just do the shadow pass, since that's going to be pretty easy. So shadow, we can see this is the result since we already rendered the previous pass. You can see this is the result we're getting. So let's go ahead. You can change around the output and everything down here, but leave these settings the same, and you can go ahead and render that out. Okay, so now with those two different renders done, we finally need to render out the ambient occlusion. Let me just show you guys what that looks like. Okay, so here's what that looks like. It's basically just the ambient occlusion that goes around the house from the ground plane touching the house. So that's going to be really nice when we need to composite that in. If you're having any issues, let's say there's some black up here or anything, that's actually because your ground plane isn't taking up the entire frame. If I go into solid view, you can see that my ground plane is taking up the entire frame. If I was to move it, let's say something like this, where it's a little bit up here, then let's render that out. You can now see that there is some black up here. So you just want to make sure that your whole ground plane covers up the whole frame, like mine does. And then you can come up to compositing. And put this AO into the composite right there, change the file location, leave all these settings the same, and then go ahead and render the animation. Okay, so now we are done with Blender. I am actually in Davinci Resolve right now. Now you can do your compositing inside Blender, but Blender really isn't the best compositing software. So I highly recommend Davinci Resolve. It's a free program and it has a really nice compositing feature. So let's go ahead and drop in our media. So come to edit. Once we're in edit, we can go ahead and drop our clips into here. So I'm just going to import some media. Find wherever your passes are. So first I'm going to do the house pass. Now you do want to select all of these. So Control A, select all those, then open. And you can see that's automatically made us a little sequence right here. And so we're just going to do those with the other ones. Okay, so now we have all of our footage in. We have the house pass, we have the shadow pass, you can't really see right there, and then the ambient occlusion pass, and then also our original movie clip. So now let's just go ahead and combine them like any other editing software. So first we need the background on the bottom layer. Then we can put our shadow. That is going to be the next thing. Then our ambient occlusion right there. And then our little house on top of that. And you will notice that the ambient occlusion, it still has that white background. To actually change that, we're just going to select this. Come down here, and for the composite, instead of normal, we need to set it on multiply right here, and that has fixed it. So we can see I'm just gonna trim some of this up just so we're not working with the whole clip and just the 100 frames I selected. So now we can see this is the base result that we got. Now to actually start compositing, what we can do is just select all these right here. Right click, I'm going to come up to New Fusion Clip, and that has made it its own clip. So now we can composite, so come inside of Fusion. Fusion is basically Davinci Resolve's node-based compositing system. So you can apply this same stuff to Blender if you want. Now I'm just going to mess around with some of the nodes, try to clean this up a bit. I like to work from right to left, so I'm just going to place all these right here, and then you can just place the media in right above the correct one. Okay, to actually view what we're working with, we can select the different nodes and hit 1 or 2 on your keyboard just to show them up here. So if I wanted this one on 1, I can just hit 1, and then this little node is on 2. You can also see which one they are based on these buttons. Now before we get started, let's go ahead and name these so we know which one we're working with. So I know this one is in 1, so this is going to be our background. So I can just hit F2 to rename it. I'm just going to name it BG for background. This one, let's hit 1. That's going to be our shadow layer, so F2 shadow. And for the other two, this is the ambient occlusion one, and then this is the house. Okay, so first thing I noticed is that the ambient occlusion still has that white background. And I guess when you make a fusion clip, that actually erases anything that you've done on the previous clips. So let's just come to this merge, and then apply mode, we'll just set that back to multiply. Okay, so now you can basically see that we have our composite pretty nice down here. However, we can do a lot to this to make this more realistic. The first thing I noticed is that we're not really getting that much ambient occlusion on the bed. In real life, if this house was actually here, we would have light hitting this little wall right here, and then that color would bounce onto this little side. So let's actually play around with that a little bit. So I'm going to bring this up, and then if you come to the effects library up here, you can search. I'm going to search for a brightness and contrast, and I can just bring this in, hold shift, and then put it in between these things. And now we have a new node. So with that, I'm just going to affect the brightness and contrast. You can actually see it's affecting the whole clip, and that's actually because we don't have the alpha affecting this. So let's just bring this and affect this blue thing. This is the effect mask, but you can think of it as basically an alpha. And then since we did that, we also need to bring this one down and affect the alpha channel as well. So now if I play around with the gain, we can see that it's actually affecting just the little ambient occlusion right here. And separate from the shadows, you can see if we do it really drastically, we can see what it's affecting. But I just want to bring that out just a tiny bit. That looks pretty good right there. And then what I can do is I actually want this to be the same color as the little wall right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this up, and then let's bring in a color corrector node. So again, drag this out, hold shift, place that there, and then we also need to bring this down to the effect mask again, and then this to the effect mask. And this is only color correcting our ambient occlusion, so right here. So if I change around that, you can see what it's doing. It's a little party going on. But all we need to do is kind of just make it a little bit tan. If you want to see your different changes, you can always turn this on and off. So you can see that basically just gives it a little hint of the wall color. And basically blends that in a little bit. Okay, so next is probably the biggest change that we can do to this render to make it look a lot more realistic, and that is to actually play around with the shadow. You can see that it's not really blending in too well, so what we can do is I'm going to bring this up here. You can actually see just one window at a time if you just select this, so we can see it a little bit bigger now. I'm just going to bring this brightness contrast node over, so just going to bring that, hold shift again, and bring it right there. And we can just bring the gamma. I think the gamma and the lift needs to go down a little bit. Oh, it is affecting everything, but we just want it to be the alpha. So let's bring that there, and we'll bring that there too. So now it'll only affect the shadow, so I'm just gonna dim the shadow just a little bit. Something like that, not too drastic. But then we need to blur it a little bit because the shadow is really sharp right now. However, you don't see any sharp shadows over here. You can kind of see on this little ridge, we have some fading shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a blur node. So a simple blur right there. And if you just click it, it'll actually go to the node below it. So that's actually really nice. Didn't know that. And then we can just mess around with the blur just a little bit. I actually think I might up there just so we can see the shadow a little bit more. And so now that's giving us a much better result and more realistic. I might actually come down here and do for the house, I might do another color corrector node like that, just because I think the house is looking a little too contrasty and everything. So let's do the contrast down, the saturation up just a tad bit, and then the gain, lift. Let's try the gamma up a little bit. Let's do the gain down a little bit. There we go. So this is after and this is before, so just trying to blend it in a little bit. Now this isn't perfect. If I was actually doing this, I would do a lot more compositing and stuff, but this was just a basic tutorial of how to actually composite with multiple render passes. Okay, so that is basically it. Now you can go ahead and render this out if this is what you like. Let me go ahead and show you the before and after. Okay, so here's the composite that we just did. We can see it looks pretty nice, and then if I go to what it was previously, here's what it was previously. Okay, so now that we have the result that we like, it's super easy to render. We just come down to this deliver. And you can actually render to YouTube and Vimeo and all that stuff, but we're just going to be rendering it on our computer. So you can name it right here, and then so you can name it and put the location right here. I'm just going to hit browse. After that's done, you can render out all this stuff. You can mess around with these settings. I'm going to keep mine to QuickTime, which is MOV, and then the codec to H.264. That's fine for me. The resolution and frame rate are both of these right here if you want to check those. And finally, we just need to add to render queue and then go ahead and render all down here. But anyways, guys, that's going to do it for this tutorial. Hope you guys learned a thing or two about multiple render passes. Now, there is a lot more stuff that you can do with this. This was kind of just the basic tutorial, trying to get you guys interested in multiple render passes and the possibilities that you have when compositing. Anyways, guys, we have a Patreon and Discord. Links to those are in the description below. But anyways, guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.